She stood on that platform for the seventh time in her life. And for the seventh time, every man in the room looked straight through her, 33 years old. Plain dress. No one's first choice. No one's second. The town of Blackstone Ridge had a name for women like Clara Whitmore, leftovers. But the man who walked in from the wilderness that afternoon wasn't looking for pretty. He was looking for someone who could survive what killed his first wife. And when he saw Clara still standing after 7 rejections, back straight, jaw set, eyes dry, he made her an offer that shocked the entire territory. Stay with us until the end. Drop your city in the comments so we can see how far this story has traveled. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel and hit that like button so you never miss what comes next. The morning of the Blackstone Ridge bride selection, Clara Whitmore ate half a biscuit she couldn't finish and told herself this time would be different. She didn't believe it, but she said it anyway, the way a person says things when the only alternative is silence. She had arrived 2 days earlier on the afternoon stage, stepping down into the dust with a worn leather suitcase and a hat that had seen better years. Blackstone Ridge was her 8th frontier town in 14 months. The 7th selection had been in a place called Harrow's Crossing, a flat, wind-scraped settlement where the selection committee had taken one look at her and asked, with genuine puzzlement, whether she had a younger sister who might be available instead. She didn't. She had packed her bag that same night. The selection hall in Blackstone Ridge was a converted feed warehouse. Wooden rafters, plank floors, 2 long tables pushed against the far wall with ceramic jugs of water that nobody touched. The morning light came in sideways through gaps in the siding and fell in pale strips across the floor. About 30 women had gathered by the time Clara arrived, most of them younger by 5 to 10 years, some of them younger than that. They arranged themselves the way women learn to arrange themselves at these things. Posture adjusted, expressions composed, hands folded with a particular brand of effortless calm that Clara had never been able to manufacture convincingly. She found a spot near the wall and stood there. A woman beside her, perhaps 24 with dark hair braided neatly back, gave her a quick, assessing look and then glanced away. Not unkind, just finished. The committee moved through the room over the following 2 hours. They were 3 men, a banker, a pastor, and a cattle broker who chewed the end of his pencil and wrote things down that he never explained. They spoke to women, nodded, made notes. Sometimes they pulled a woman aside to a separate corner where the men waiting outside could meet her. Those women often didn't come back into the main room. The hall thinned steadily. By noon, Clara had spoken to the committee once. The banker had asked her age, her occupation. She said domestic management, which was the honest answer even if it sounded like she was inflating laundry. And whether she had family in the territory. She said no. He wrote something down. The pastor gave her a practiced, impersonal smile and moved on. By 2 in the afternoon, there were 6 women left in the room, including Clara. By 3, there were 2. The other woman was perhaps 50, with a kind face and the posture of someone who had stopped expecting the world to accommodate her. She and Clara stood on opposite ends of the room and did not speak to each other, which Clara understood. There was nothing useful to say. The hall smelled like sawdust and stale water, and the particular staleness of a day that had gone the way both of them already knew it was going. The cattle broker came back inside at 3:30 and told them the selection was concluded for the day. He said it the way a man says something he has said many times and no longer thinks about. He offered both women a listing of domestic work available in town, cooking positions, laundry contracts, a household on the north end that needed a live-in helper for an elderly widow. He slid the paper across the table toward them and left. Clara looked at the paper for a long moment. She didn't pick it up. The other woman took it gently, folded it, and put it in her coat pocket. She looked at Clara with an expression that wasn't pity exactly, more like recognition. "You going to take the stage out?" she asked. "I haven't decided," Clara said. That was only half true. She had decided. She just hadn't decided where. She walked outside into the afternoon heat. The selection platform, a raised wooden stage built at the edge of the town square, constructed specifically for these events, stood empty now, the small crowd that had gathered in the morning entirely dispersed. A dog crossed the square at a diagonal, uninterested in anything. Somewhere down the main street, a door banged shut in the wind. Clara sat down on the bottom step of the platform and put her suitcase beside her and pressed her hands flat on her thighs and breathed. 7 times. She was 33 years old and she had stood on 7 platforms, and every time, without exception, she had been the woman left at the end. Not because she was cruel, not because she was stupid or dishonest or difficult to be around. She knew her own faults. She was stubborn. She had a temper she kept leashed, but not always successfully. She said what she thought more often than was socially convenient. But none of those things were the reason. The reason was simpler and harder, and it had nothing to do with who she was on the inside, which was the part that made it so exhausting to carry. She heard horses before she saw anything. Not the ordinary sound of a single rider, but the dense, compacted noise of a group moving with purpose. She looked up. 6 riders came into the square from the western road, trail-dusted and serious. The man at the front rode a dark horse and sat the saddle the way some men do. Like the horse and the ground beneath it are both just arrangements that exist for his convenience. He was somewhere in his early 40s, broad through the shoulders, with a jaw that looked like it had been cut from something harder than the usual material. He wore a coat that had been good quality once and had been repaired in several places since. He did not look like a man who spent time thinking about his coat. He pulled up in front of the square and looked around the way a man looks when he's assessing something rather than seeing it. His eyes moved across the empty platform, across the dispersed crowd, across the warehouse door. Then they landed on Clara. She didn't look away. She had learned years ago that looking away was worse. He held her gaze for a moment, then swung down from the horse and handed the reins to one of the men behind him. He walked toward the committee warehouse with the deliberate stride of someone who expected the door to open before he reached it, which it did. The cattle broker appeared in the doorway with an expression of mild alarm. "Mr. Voss," the broker said. "Selection's done?" the man said. His voice was lower than Clara expected. Not soft, just economical. "Concluded about an hour ago, sir. We didn't expect— I sent word 3 days ago I'd be coming. Word didn't arrive, sir. I'm sorry for the— Who's left?" The broker hesitated. His eyes flicked involuntarily, the way eyes do, toward Clara on the platform step. The man followed his gaze. Clara stood up, not because she was trying to present herself, because sitting while someone assessed her felt worse. The man, Voss, the broker had called him, looked at her directly, not the way most men looked at women on selection platforms, cataloging features against some internal checklist. He looked at her the way you look at something you're trying to understand. "How many selections have you been through?" he asked. Just like that. No preamble. Clara felt the question land somewhere unpleasant. "This was my 8th town," she said. 7th selection. Something moved across his face. Not pity, she was certain of that. "And you're still here." "I haven't decided where to go next." "What's your name?" "Clara Whitmore." He nodded once, as if filing it. "Colton Voss. I run Iron Valley Ranch, northwest of here, 3 hours by horse." He paused. "Can you ride?" "Yes." "Can you manage a household? Not supervise one, manage one." "There's a difference." "Yes." "Are you easily frightened?" Clara thought about the last 14 months, the stages, the hotels with thin walls, the selection halls, and the walk back to whatever room she was renting afterward. "No," she said. Voss studied her for another moment. "The broker can tell you what I'm offering. It's not a conventional proposal." He glanced back at the broker, who had remained frozen in the doorway, like a man uncertain whether to advance or retreat. "Explain the arrangement." The broker looked deeply uncomfortable, but came down the step and cleared his throat and explained, in the manner of a man reading from a document he hadn't written, that Colton Voss of Iron Valley Ranch was offering a supervised courtship arrangement, a 60-day trial period during which Clara would live and work at the ranch under proper conditions, with full staff present, no obligations on either side, and a binding agreement to part ways at the end of 60 days if either party chose not to continue. "It isn't marriage," the broker said carefully. "Not yet," Voss said from behind him. Clara looked at the man. He was watching her with that same measuring attention, not impatient, not performing patience either, just waiting in the way of someone who had decided to wait and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. Why me? Clara said. Because you've been told no 7 times and you're still standing upright. She hadn't expected that answer. She didn't know what she'd expected, but not that. That's a strange reason to court someone. I'm not looking for a reason to fall in love, he said. I had a wife. She was a good woman. She couldn't handle what the ranch required. I'm not interested in going through that again. He didn't say it coldly. He said it the way people state facts that have cost them something. I need someone who can survive. You've had 7 reasons to break and you haven't. That tells me more than 2 hours of conversation would. Claire was quiet for a moment. Down the street, a shutter banged again in the wind. What are the conditions? She said. Separate quarters. You work with the household staff. You see how the ranch operates. At 60 days, you tell me yes or no, and I tell you yes or no. And whichever answer you get, you leave with your expenses covered and a fair wage for your time. And if I say no at the end, then I take you back to town and you have money in your pocket, which is more than you have now. It was, Clara noted, an accurate statement. She thought about the piece of paper the broker had left on the table inside, the domestic work listings, the elderly widow on the north end who needed a helper. She thought about the stage schedule and the money in her bag and the next town on the line after Blackstone Ridge, which she'd already looked up in a reflexive, habitual way the morning she arrived. 60 days, she said. 60 days. And you're honest. Whatever you decide, you tell me directly. I don't have a talent for anything else, he said. She picked up her suitcase. My horse needs water before we ride, she said. So do I. Something shifted at the edge of Voss's expression, not quite a smile, but the structural precondition for one. He turned to the broker. See to it. The ride to Iron Valley Ranch took just under 3 hours on a road that became progressively less of a road and more of a suggestion. Clara rode a bay mare borrowed from the livery, and Voss rode ahead of the group without performing the fact of leading it, which she noticed. His men were quiet in the way that men are quiet when they've worked together long enough to have said most things already. She had expected Voss to try to sell her on the journey, on the ranch, on himself, on the arrangement. He didn't. He answered her questions when she asked them. He didn't ask many in return. When the valley finally opened below them at dusk, Clara stopped her horse without intending to. Iron Valley was larger than anything she'd imagined from the description. The main house sat on a rise above a wide sweep of grassland, 2 stories of dark timber and stone, with a long porch and windows that caught the last light. Below it, the working buildings spread out in a practical cluster: bunkhouse, storage barns, a cookhouse, corrals that extended further than she could see clearly in the dying light. Cattle moved in slow, indifferent shapes across the far fields. It's a lot to look at the first time, said one of Voss's men, a younger one riding up beside her. He had an open face and seemed friendlier than the others. Name's Pete, ma'am. I run the supply lines. Clara Whitmore. Yes, ma'am. The boss told us you were coming. He paused. Some of the men had, opinions about that. I imagine they did, Clara said. Wade Mercer had the most opinions. Which one is Wade Mercer? Pete nodded toward a heavy-set man riding near the rear of the group, who had said nothing on the entire journey and had a specific quality of silence that wasn't peace. He's been here 8 years, thinks he knows what the ranch needs. And what does he think the ranch needs? Pete considered this with honest effort. Not you, ma'am. No offense. None taken, Clara said. At least he's consistent with everyone else. She urged the horse forward down into the valley, toward the lights of the house coming on one by one against the early dark. Behind her, she could feel Wade Mercer's silence, like something pressed between her shoulder blades. But she didn't look back. The housekeeper, a compact, gray-haired woman named Ruth, met them at the door with the expression of someone who had agreed to something she wasn't certain about and was reserving judgment. She showed Clara to a room on the 2nd floor, small, clean, with a window that looked out over the south pasture. A wash basin, a real mattress, a hook on the door. Clara set her suitcase down on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the ceiling. 8 towns, 7 rejections, 1 man who had chosen her not because she was beautiful or young or easy to look at, but because she hadn't quit. She didn't know what to make of Colton Voss. She didn't know if the 60 days would end in anything or simply in another stage ride to another town. She didn't know if she was brave or just too stubborn to recognize when she was beaten. What she knew was this: the room had a real mattress, the window faced south, and nobody here had called her a leftover yet. That was enough for one night. She blew out the lamp and lay back in the dark, listening to the sounds of a working ranch settling into evening. The distant low of cattle, the creak of the bunkhouse, boots on the porch below, someone calling something to someone else in a voice too low to make out. She closed her eyes. She did not sleep easily, but she slept. She slept better than she expected, which surprised her, and woke before dawn to the sound of the ranch already moving beneath her window. Clara lay still for a moment and listened. Boots on gravel. Someone calling across the yard about a gate that hadn't been latched. The low complaint of cattle being moved somewhere they didn't want to go. A ranch didn't wait for daylight to begin its business, and this one apparently didn't wait for its newest arrival to collect herself either. She dressed, braided her hair back the way she always did. Practical, not pretty, a habit so old it required no thought, and went downstairs. Ruth was already in the kitchen, moving between the stove and the work table with the efficiency of a woman who had organized this space to suit herself over a long period of time, and did not particularly welcome input. She glanced at Clara when she came in and said nothing, which Clara chose to interpret as neutrality rather than hostility. "Can I help?" Clara asked. "Breakfast for 22 men goes out at 6, Ruth said. "You know how to make biscuits?" "Yes." Ruth pointed at a bowl and a sack of flour without further comment. Clara made biscuits. She made a great many of them, because 22 men ate more than most people thought possible, and while she worked, she paid attention to the kitchen the way she paid attention to most things, quietly, methodically, filing observations she didn't yet know the use of. The flour sack was only a third full. The salt pork hanging near the back door was down to 2 pieces. There were 3 jars of preserved beans on the shelf, and one of them had a broken seal, which meant it had been sitting there doing nothing useful for however long no one had thought to check it. She asked Ruth about the supply schedule. Ruth gave her a sideways look. "Pete brings supplies in from Blackstone Ridge every 2 weeks. "What's the head count been lately? It looks like the stores are running short for the rotation." "We added 4 men in September," Ruth said after a pause, "for the fall drive. And nobody adjusted the order." Ruth didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. The biscuits went out with the rest of the breakfast and came back empty, which was a reasonable indicator they'd been acceptable. Claire spent the rest of the morning following Ruth through the household work and saying very little, watching the way things moved and where they stalled and what got done twice, because nobody had arranged for it to happen once cleanly. Colton appeared at the kitchen door mid-morning, hat in hand, which she noticed was a courtesy she hadn't expected from him. "How was the first night?" "Fine," Clara said. "Your supply order is running about a week short for the head count you're carrying. I'd like to go through the full inventory before Pete's next run." He blinked, just slightly. Ruth's been doing it alone," Clara said. "An extra set of eyes won't hurt." He looked at her for a moment. "All right." He put his hat back on. "Supper at 6. I'd like you to eat with the household, not the crew, until people settle in." He said it matter-of-factly, not as a control, more as a logistical caution. "Some of the men are adjusting to the arrangement." "Is Wade Mercer adjusting?" Claire asked. Something tightened briefly at the corner of his jaw. "He'll adjust," Colton said, and left. He was wrong about that, or at least wrong about the timeline. Clara met Wade Mercer properly on her 3rd morning, when she went out to the storage barn to begin the inventory she'd asked permission to conduct. She had a ledger she'd borrowed from the household records and a pencil and the intention of spending 2 focused hours counting things that needed counting. Mercer was in the barn when she arrived, doing something with a length of rope that didn't appear to urgently need doing. He was a big man, not tall, but constructed solidly, with a face weathered into permanent skepticism. He looked at her when she came in and didn't move. "Morning," Clara said. "You're in the barn," he said. "I'm doing inventory." "Ruth does inventory." "Ruth and I are doing it together now." This was not entirely accurate. Ruth had expressed cautious willingness and then found other things to attend to. But the principle was sound. Do you know when the harness oil was last restocked? Do I? He set the rope down. Lady, I don't know what the boss told you about this place, but the ranch ran fine before you got here. Clara wrote something in the ledger. When was the harness oil restocked? I'm not answering that. All right, I'll find the record. She moved past him toward the shelving along the back wall. She could feel him watching her with the specific quality of attention that meant she was being sized up for how quickly she'd flinch. She'd been sized up that way many times in her life, and it had stopped producing any particular result in her. She found the supply log, a battered book tucked between two crates. She opened it and read it. The harness oil had last been restocked 4 months ago. The log says August, she said. Then the log says August. You've got 12 horses and 2 mules. August isn't enough. She wrote the number down. I'm not criticizing how the barn is run. I'm noting what needs ordering. Mercer walked toward the door, then stopped. He didn't turn around. You know how many women Voss has looked at since he lost his wife? Not just selections, conversations, possibilities. Women from decent families who made sense for a place like this. He paused. And he rode back from Blackstone Ridge with you. A woman nobody wanted. You understand how that looks? Clara kept writing in the ledger. Her handwriting didn't change. I understand exactly how it looks, she said. What's the current count on the plow chains? He left without answering. She counted the plow chains herself. There were 7, which was too short for the field equipment currently in use. She wrote it down. That evening at supper, the household table, herself and Ruth and Colton and, unexpectedly, Pete, who it turned out ate with the household on Tuesdays for reasons nobody explained, Clara presented the inventory summary. She'd written it out on 2 pages in clear columns. What was short, what was about to run short, and what needed to be added to Pete's next supply run based on current headcount. Colton read it without speaking. He turned the second page over. He read it again. The harness oil, he said. 4 months. I didn't know it had been that long. The supply log was in the storage barn. I don't think anyone had looked at it recently. Pete leaned over to see the pages and let out a low whistle that Ruth shushed immediately. Colton set the papers down. He looked at Clara with an expression that was difficult to read. Not impressed exactly, more like recalibrating. You do this in 2 days. I had time and a pencil, Clara said. It's not complicated. It just needed doing. Ruth is managing this entire household by herself, Clara said. She doesn't have time to cross-reference the barn log against the supply rotation. Nobody does when they're working alone. She paused. I'm not saying anything was done wrong. I'm saying it's easier with 2 people. Ruth, across the table, had the expression of a woman who was not going to say anything, but was privately revising an opinion. Colton handed the pages back to Clara. Add whatever you think is needed to Pete's list. I'll sign off on it. I already added it, Clara said. The list is on the back of the second page. Pete laughed, a short, genuine sound, and then composed himself when nobody else did. The weeks that followed were not smooth. Clara hadn't expected them to be, and she would have been suspicious of smooth. The ranch was a living organism with 22 opinions about how things should run and a long institutional memory for how they had always run, and she was an outsider who had arrived under circumstances that made most of the crew uncomfortable. She understood that. She didn't argue with it. She just kept showing up. She reorganized the meal rotation, working with Ruth to vary what came out of the cookhouse in a way that cost no more but reduced the specific gray fatigue that sets in when men eat the same 4 things in the same order every week. She fixed the broken seal on the bean jar herself before anyone noticed she'd found it. She went over the household accounts with Colton on a Wednesday evening and pointed out that they were paying 2 separate vendors in Blackstone Ridge for items available at a single supplier for less, which was the kind of thing that happens when no one has time to compare invoices. He listened to all of it with the same attention he seemed to give most things. Present, not distracted, but not performing interest either. He asked questions that were specific and useful. He didn't thank her for things unnecessarily, which she found she preferred to excessive gratitude, which always felt like surprise. You've done this before. he said one evening. It wasn't a question. I've managed houses, Clara said. Not ranches, but the principle is the same. Things need tracking, things need ordering, and someone needs to know where everything is. Where'd you learn it? My mother, she said. She ran a boarding house in Ohio for 15 years after my father left. She kept track of everything. She had to. She paused. She died when I was 26. I kept the house running for another year after, then sold it when the owner came back and wanted possession. After that, She stopped. After that, Colton said, I was trying to figure out what came next. She said it simply, because it was simple, even if it hadn't felt that way. This is what came next, I suppose. He was quiet for a moment. The lamp between them made the room feel smaller than it was. My wife's name was Margaret, he said. He said it the way you say a name you've carried a long time, carefully, because it's still breakable. She came from a family in Missouri, good family. She wanted the frontier life. She thought she did. He stopped. She lasted 3 winters. The isolation got into her. The 4th winter, she had the baby too early. There wasn't a doctor close enough. He stopped again. Neither of them made it. Clara didn't say she was sorry because he didn't seem to be telling it to receive comfort. He was telling it the way people sometimes need to tell a thing to someone new. Not to relieve themselves of it, but to make sure it still meant what it always meant. To check that it was still real. I'm not looking to replace her, Colton said. I know, Clara said. I'm not looking to be anyone's replacement. He looked at her directly. Then what are you looking for? She thought about it honestly. Somewhere that needs what I can actually do, she said. Not somewhere that needs me to be younger or prettier or easier to look at. Somewhere that needs this. She gestured vaguely at the account books between them. He held her gaze for a moment. The ranch needs exactly that, he said. It was not a declaration, it was not a romantic statement of any kind, but it was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in years, and she felt it settle somewhere in her chest like something finally set down after a long carry. Wade Mercer didn't soften as the weeks passed. If anything, he watched her more, not less. A surveillance she felt at meals, across the yard, in the small daily transactions of a working ranch. He didn't approach her again directly. He worked around her the way water works around a stone, finding the longer route with studied casualness. What changed was the crew. It happened without ceremony, the way most real changes happen. A man named Dix, who ran the East Pasture crew and had treated Clara with courteous indifference since her arrival, came to the kitchen one afternoon with a question about the meal schedule. Could they get something hot earlier on days when the crew came in from the East Fields? Because by the time they rode back, whatever was on the table had been sitting too long. He asked it humbly, like he wasn't sure it was his place to ask. What time do you come in from the East Fields? Clara asked. 5, usually. Sometimes 4:30. I'll talk to Ruth about having something ready at 5. If you can send word ahead when it's 4:30, we can do that too. Dix looked at her like she'd said something surprising. Yes, ma'am. Thank you, he told the other men. She didn't know that for certain, but things like that travel in a bunkhouse at the speed of anything useful, and after that, more of the crew addressed her directly when there was something practical to discuss, which there usually was on a working ranch. Wade noticed. She could see it in the set of his shoulders when she came into the yard. A stiffening, a recalculation. He had assumed she would fail, and she had not failed, and he was still deciding what to do with that information. The confrontation, when it came, happened in front of 3 men, and Ruthin was over in less than 2 minutes. Mercer came into the kitchen at supper preparation, which he'd never done before, and stood in the doorway with his arms crossed and said, addressing the room in general, but looking at no one in particular, "Seems like things are getting rearranged around here without much conversation with the men who actually run the place." Clara was cutting potatoes. She kept cutting. "Is there something specific you'd like to discuss?" The supply order came in different from how it's always come in. "Yes, I adjusted it based on the current head count and the inventory." "I've been on this ranch 8 years, Mercer said. Nobody asked me about the inventory." "Would you like to be involved in future inventory assessments?" Clara said. "You'd actually be useful in the barn. You know where everything is better than anyone." That stopped him. He'd come in looking for a wall to push against, and she'd opened a door instead, and he wasn't prepared for that. His arms dropped slightly. "I'm not trying to change how this ranch operates," Clara said, still cutting. "I'm trying to make sure it has what it needs to operate. Those are different things." She looked up at him then, directly. "You've been here 8 years. That means you care about this place. So do I, even if I've only been here 5 weeks. That should make us on the same side." The kitchen was very quiet. Mercer looked at her for a long moment. He didn't agree. He didn't apologize. But he left without saying anything else, which was, Clara understood, as much as she was likely to get for now. That evening, Colton stopped her in the hall on the way to her room. He said only, "Heard about the kitchen." "It was fine," Clara said. "Mercer doesn't back down from arguments." "I didn't give him one to back down from." He looked at her steadily. "Anyone who disrespects you here answers to me. That's not a small thing." "I know," she said, "but I'd rather handle it myself when I can." He was quiet for a moment, and then he nodded, once, the way he always nodded, as if he'd asked himself whether something was reasonable and confirmed that it was. "Then I'll let you," he said. She went upstairs to her room and sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her hands flat on her thighs the way she had done on the first night. And she thought about the fact that she was now in week 5 and the ranch was running better than it had been. And 2 of the men who had looked through her when she arrived now said good morning, like they meant it. 60 days had seemed like an uncertain country when she'd agreed to them on that platform step in Blackstone Ridge. It was starting to feel, in small and cautious increments, like something else entirely. The 60 days came and went without either of them mentioning it. Clara noticed the date. She had been keeping rough track in the back of the household ledger, a habit from the boarding house years, marking time not out of anxiety, but because her mother had taught her that a woman who loses track of time loses track of everything else soon after. The 60th day was a Tuesday, cold and overcast, with a smell in the air that Ruth said meant real weather coming. Clara noted it, went about her work, and said nothing. Colton said nothing either. The deadline passed like an unmarked fence post on a long road, and neither of them acknowledged it had ever existed. That, she understood, was its own kind of answer. What followed was a quieter, stranger adjustment than the first weeks had been. The practical business between them had settled into a rhythm that worked. She managed the household and the supply lines, consulted with Colton on anything that crossed into ranch operations, and had established enough credibility with the crew that even Mercer had developed a grudging, wordless respect that expressed itself mainly in the form of no longer making her feel unwelcome in her own kitchen. Ruth had begun teaching her the particular geography of the ranch's seasonal needs, the way the pantry requirements shifted as winter approached, the way certain men got difficult in November when the short days started and the isolation set in. But underneath all of that practical machinery, something else had started turning, and Clara couldn't name it precisely because she'd spent enough of her life being wrong about things like this that she'd learned to distrust her own readings of the situation. Colton was not a man who said unnecessary things. He also was not a man who avoided necessary ones. He had told her on the first night at the table that he wasn't looking for romance, and she had accepted that at face value, because it was the sensible thing to accept, and because she'd had no reason, then, to expect anything different. But the weeks had changed the texture of their evening conversations in ways she noticed without planning to. He asked about her day not as a social formality, but with the specific attention of someone who expected a real answer and intended to follow up. He remembered things she'd mentioned, offhandedly in passing, and referenced them days later in ways that told her he'd been thinking about them. He had started sitting across from her at the household table rather than at the head of it, which might have meant nothing, and might have meant something, and she couldn't tell which. She didn't ask. She didn't know how to ask without changing something she wasn't sure she wanted changed yet. It was Pete who first mentioned Silver Creek, on a Thursday morning when he was going over the supply list with Clara in the kitchen. A social gathering, not a dance exactly, more of a seasonal gathering that the wealthier families in the territory held in Silver Creek at the end of every autumn, before the winter made the roads difficult. "Boss usually goes," Pete said, adding it to the conversation with the studied casualness of someone who had been instructed to add it casually. He mentioned you'd be going this year. Clara looked up from the list. He mentioned that to you? He mentioned it to me and asked me to mention it to you. Yes, ma'am. He couldn't mention it to me himself? Pete smiled at his boots. I think he was working up to it. Colton did mention it himself that evening, with the slightly stiff formality of a man who had decided to do something and was not going to be graceful about it. They would attend the Silver Creek gathering on Saturday. It was a practical matter, good for the ranch's standing in the territory, useful for trade connections. He said all of this without quite looking at her, which was unlike him, and Clara let him finish before she said that she'd need to press her good dress, and could Ruth help her with her hair. He stopped, looked at her. That's it? What were you expecting? I don't know, he said honestly. More argument. I don't argue against things I don't object to, Clara said. He left looking mildly disarmed, which she found privately satisfying in a way she was careful not to examine too closely. Silver Creek was 3 hours south on a road that was in considerably better condition than the one leading to the ranch, and they made the trip in Colton's wagon, dressed in their better clothes, with the particular discomfort of two people who have been comfortable together in work clothes now suddenly facing each other in formal ones. Colton had cleaned up with the thoroughness of a man who does it rarely and therefore does it completely. Coat brushed, jaw shaved clean, hat newer than his usual one. He looked different in a way Clara wasn't prepared for, and she chose not to look at him too directly for the first hour of the ride. She had worn her best dress, which was navy wool, well made but several years old and conservative by any measure. Ruth had helped with her hair, pinning it up in a style that was more elaborate than Clara usually bothered with. And when she'd looked in the small mirror above the wash basin, she'd had the disorienting experience of looking almost, not quite, like the kind of woman who got chosen at selection platforms. The Hargrove estate, where the gathering was held, was the largest private house Clara had seen since leaving Ohio. A long drive of bare November trees, a stone house with lit windows, carriages lined up along the side lane. Inside, warmth, lamplight, perhaps 60 people arranged in the practiced clusters of a society that knew itself well and was alert to newcomers. Clara had navigated enough difficult rooms in her life to know how to move through one without making it worse. She stayed near Colton's left shoulder, not clinging, just present, and followed his lead through the introductions, which were numerous and which required her to smile and nod and respond to questions about herself with just enough information to be polite and not enough to invite further excavation. The first hour was manageable. The second was when things shifted. Colton was pulled into a conversation on the far side of the room by two men who appeared to have a business matter that couldn't wait, and Clara found herself standing near the fireplace with a cup of something warm and a group of 3 women she'd been introduced to an hour earlier. They were wives of significant landowners, younger than Clara, dressed in the particular way of women who have time and money to spend on being dressed. And they had been cordial in the superficial register of people who have not yet decided what they think. They decided during the second hour. It started with questions that weren't quite questions. Was it true that she had come to Blackstone Ridge on the selection circuit? How many towns had she been through? They asked it with the careful neutrality of women who know exactly what they're doing. Clara answered directly because she had stopped pretending these things hadn't happened long before she arrived in this territory, and directness at least denied them the pleasure of extraction. Colton Voss is a remarkable man, said the eldest of them, a woman named Harriet Aldenmore, wife of the biggest cattle broker in Silver Creek, with the composed authority of someone who has been the most important woman in most rooms for a long time. It's surprising he chose someone from the selection circuit. He could have approached any of the established families. I imagine he approached whoever suited his needs, Clara said pleasantly. His needs, Harriet repeated, as if tasting the word. Yes, I suppose that's one way to describe a housekeeper arrangement. The other 2 women didn't laugh. They did something worse. They looked away, which was the social equivalent of pretending not to have heard a gunshot. Clara set her cup down on the mantelpiece. She did it without haste. Mrs. Aldenmore, she said, I've been rejected in 7 different frontier towns because I wasn't young enough or pretty enough to satisfy someone's idea of what a wife should be. I'm familiar with this kind of conversation. It doesn't require a fireplace and nice dresses to have the same effect. Harriet's expression tightened. My marriage may have started as an arrangement, Clara continued, keeping her voice even, because losing the steadiness now would undo everything. Most marriages in this territory start as some form of arrangement, land considerations, family connections, financial agreements dressed up in romantic language. At least ours was honest about what it was. She paused. The difference is that my husband doesn't require me to perform contentment. He requires me to be useful and to be honest. I find that considerably easier than the alternative. The fireplace crackled. Somewhere across the room, a fiddle was starting up. Harriet Aldenmore looked at Clara for a long moment with the expression of a woman recalculating something she'd believed settled. Before she could respond, Clara felt a presence at her side and turned to find Colton standing there. She didn't know how long he'd been there or how much he'd heard, and his face gave nothing away. He looked at Harriet Aldenmore with the polite regard of a man who has absolutely no intention of explaining himself. Then he turned to Clara. "They're starting a reel," he said. "Dance with me." Clara blinked. "I didn't know you danced." "I don't particularly," he said. "Come anyway." She took his arm. She heard, as they moved away, the silence behind them, the specific charged silence of a room that has witnessed something it will be discussing for the rest of the evening. Colton guided her to the edge of the floor where other couples were arranging themselves and put his hand at her waist with the same practical directness he brought to everything else, and they joined the reel. He was not, as advertised, a particularly good dancer. He was competent, which was enough, and he was present, which was more than enough. And after the first few bars of music, she stopped noticing his footwork because she was too aware of the way the room had shifted around them, heads turning, conversations pausing, the general reconfiguration of an audience that had arrived with one narrative and was now being offered another. "How much did you hear?" Clara said, between movements. "Enough," Colton said. "You don't have to defend me by dancing with me." "I know," he said. "I wanted to dance with you." She looked at him. He was looking back at her with the same direct regard he'd given her on the platform step in Blackstone Ridge, and something about it hit her differently now than it had then. Perhaps because she'd had 8 weeks to understand that when Colton Voss looked at you directly, it was not a social gesture, it was the real thing. She didn't say anything else. They finished the dance and then, because the fiddle went directly into a second reel without pausing, they stayed on the floor for that one too. They rode back to Iron Valley in the dark, the wagon lanterns throwing a small, warm circle against the cold. Clara sat with her coat pulled close and watched the road unspool ahead of them. Colton drove without speaking, but it was the comfortable silence they'd built over 2 months of evenings rather than the careful silence of their first days, and it felt different from the inside. "What you said to Harriet Aldenmore," he said eventually. "I meant it," Clara said, in case he had doubts. "I know you meant it." He adjusted the reins. "It was—" He paused in the way he paused when he was being precise. "It needed saying." "It needed saying for my benefit more than anyone else's," Clara admitted. "I've been telling myself the same things for years. It helped to say them out loud to someone who deserved to hear them less charitably." He made a sound that might have been a laugh, quickly controlled. "You have a particular way with people, Clara." "I've been told I'm too direct." "You've been told a lot of things," he said, and there was something in the way he said it. Not angry exactly, but with an undercurrent of quiet displeasure at the world that had told her those things, that she felt in her sternum. She looked at his profile in the dark. The clean jaw, the new hat, the hands on the reins. The man who had chosen her because she hadn't broken, and who was possibly, cautiously, choosing her now for reasons that had nothing to do with her tolerance for hardship. She was still thinking about that when the storm hit. It didn't announce itself with much warning. Frontier winter rarely did. The temperature had dropped steadily through the week after Silver Creek, and Ruth began saying things like, "It's coming," with the certainty of someone who had spent enough winters here to read the signs and the quality of the cold. The sky on the morning of the storm was the particular flat white of a sky that has made a decision, and by noon the wind had started, and by late afternoon what was falling from the sky was no longer just snow. It came in sideways and fast, the kind of storm that turns the world past the window into a white nothing. The men brought in what they could before the visibility dropped. Clara could hear the shouting in the yard, the sound of the barn doors, the particular urgency of a working ranch trying to outrun weather. She and Ruth moved through the house, securing what needed securing, putting food on for whenever the men came in, filling every available container with water from the well before it potentially froze. Colton was out with the crew working the south pasture, where a section of fence had been reported weak the day before and needed shoring up before the storm hit in earnest. He had left mid-afternoon with Dix and two others, saying he'd be back by dark. Dark came. He wasn't. The crew that returned to the bunkhouse reported that Colton's group had split off to check the far end of the south fence line, further out, past where most of the men had been working. The storm had moved in faster than expected. Nobody could see more than 30 feet. Clara stood at the kitchen window for 3 minutes, watching the white darkness outside, and then she stopped watching it and started doing things. She organized what she knew. Colton and Dix and two hands, south pasture, far fence line. The storm had hit hardest from the northwest, which meant they would try to come back from the east to avoid the worst of it. The south barn had a lean-to on the east side with emergency supplies. She knew because she had inventoried it in her first week. She asked Pete, who had come in with the second crew and was standing uselessly in the kitchen doorway, whether anyone had checked the south barn's emergency shelter. "In this?" Pete said. "Someone needs to," Clara said. "Clara, the visibility out there is—" "I know what the visibility is," she said. "Who knows the south pasture road well enough to run a rope line?" 3 men volunteered. Of the 3, she chose the one who had grown up in this valley, a quiet hand named Calhoun, who she'd spoken to maybe 4 times, but who Pete said could find the south barn blind if he had to. She sent Calhoun with 50 feet of rope, instructions to tie one end to the fence post at the yard's edge and follow the post line, and a lantern that probably wouldn't last long in the wind, but was better than nothing. She had the other 2 men build up the kitchen fire to its highest and put 2 pots of water on to heat and told Ruth to find every blanket in the house she could spare. Then she waited. Waiting was, in Claire's experience, one of the harder things. She was not naturally patient. She had learned to be patient the way you learn any unpleasant skill, through repetition and necessity, but it never became easy. She stood at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the surface and listened to the storm work at the windows, and told herself that Colton Voss had survived many winters in this valley, and he was not a careless man, and he knew this land, and Dix was with him. She told herself these things and believed them imperfectly and kept her hands on the table. 2 hours after Calhoun went out, the back door opened. Colton came in first, or rather, he came through the door, supported on one side by Calhoun and the other by Dix, barely upright, coat plastered white, the kind of cold on him that went beyond shivering into something deeper and more dangerous. Dix was in similar condition. The 2 other hands came behind them, moving under their own power but barely. Clara was already moving. She had the blankets. She had the hot water and dry cloths and the knowledge, from a practical book she'd read in her boarding house years when her mother was ill, of what cold does to a body and what you do about it in order. Warmth, slow and controlled, not fast, dry clothing, heat from the inside as soon as a person could manage it. She didn't hesitate, and she didn't ask permission, and she didn't stop to feel anything about the fact that the man she was pulling wet coat off of was the same man who had danced with her in Silver Creek 6 days ago. There would be time to feel things later. Colton was conscious, which mattered. He was not fully coherent, which was expected. He said her name twice while she was working, and the second time she said, "I know, I'm here, stop talking," which was perhaps not the most tender thing anyone had ever said to an injured person, but seemed to work because he stopped talking. It took most of the night. By 2 in the morning, he was warm enough, stable enough, sitting up against the kitchen wall wrapped in 3 blankets with a cup of broth Ruth had made that he was holding with both hands. The color had come back. The shivering had moved from the dangerous kind to the ordinary kind. Dix was in the bunkhouse, reported recovering by the man the crew had designated as their rough field medic. Clara sat on the kitchen floor across from Colton. She had stopped being able to stand some hours back, and the floor was where she'd ended up, and she hadn't moved because it didn't seem worth the effort, and looked at him. He looked back at her over the rim of the cup. "You organized all of this," he said. It wasn't a question. Someone had to. "Pete said you sent Calhoun out with the rope." It was the most useful thing I could think of. Colton was quiet for a moment. The fire had burned down to a good steady bed of coals, and the wind outside had dropped in the last hour to something that was still fierce but no longer sounded like it intended to remove the roof. Ruth had gone to bed at midnight with Clara's firm insistence. The kitchen was very still. "I told you I chose you because you could survive," Colton said. "You did." "I was right about that." He paused. He set the cup down carefully, as if it required concentration. "I was wrong about it being the only reason." Clara looked at him. His face in the firelight was tired and honest and entirely without the management that most people applied to their faces when they were about to say something that mattered. "I know," she said quietly. He held her gaze. "You know, I've known for a few weeks," she said. "I wasn't sure what to do about it." "Neither was I," he said. They sat with that for a moment, the two of them on the kitchen floor in the middle of the night after a storm, not saying anything further, which seemed to be enough. Outside, the wind shifted. The worst of it had passed. He recovered slowly, which frustrated him in a way that Clara found almost endearing. Colton Voss was not a man built for stillness. The third morning after the storm, she came downstairs to find him already dressed and heading for the back door, and she told him to sit down with a directness that surprised them both. He sat. He didn't like it. He argued that the south fence still needed proper repair, and that Dix couldn't supervise it alone in his condition, and that the East Pasture crew had questions about the winter rotation that required his attention. Clara listened to all of this with the patience of a woman who has heard reasonable-sounding arguments for unreasonable things before. And then she said, "You were hypothermic 3 nights ago. The fence will stand another week. Dix is fine. Pete can take the East Pasture questions. Pete doesn't know the winter rotation well enough to—" "Then write it down for him," Clara said, "and he will." Colton looked at her with the expression of a man who knows he's losing an argument and hasn't yet accepted it. "You're very difficult," he said. "I've been told," she said. "Sit down and eat your breakfast." He sat down and ate his breakfast, and she could see it cost him something, that sitting, not the physical act but the surrender of momentum, the admission that he was not, for the moment, capable of the things he was used to being capable of. She understood that cost. She'd paid versions of it herself, in different currencies, over the years. She didn't remark on it. She just kept his coffee full and made sure Ruth knew to bring the East Pasture reports to the kitchen table rather than the barn office, so he could read them without getting up. Ruth watched this arrangement with the expression of a woman privately revising a ledger that she'd thought was balanced. The acknowledgement that had passed between them on the kitchen floor the night of the storm, that careful, mutual recognition, nothing declared but nothing hidden either, didn't transform things overnight. That wasn't how either of them operated, and they both seemed to understand this without saying it. What it did was remove a kind of low-grade tension that Clara hadn't fully noticed until it was gone, the way you don't notice a sound until it stops. They talked more easily, not about different things, but in a different register, less careful about what the words might mean, more willing to follow a thought to its actual end. One evening, 4 days into his recovery, he told her about the first winter with Margaret, how she had loved the ranch in the autumn, genuinely, the space of it, the way the light fell across the valley in October, how that love had started fraying at the edges when the first real cold came and the road to town became impassable for weeks, how she would stand at the window for long stretches in January saying nothing, and he hadn't known how to reach her, hadn't known whether reaching was even his place to do. He told it without drama, piecing it out in the measured way of someone who has worked through the grief, but not all the guilt. "She was lonely," Clara said. "Yes." "And you didn't know how to fix it." "No." He paused. "I kept thinking if I made the ranch work better, if the operation was stronger, if there was more money and more security, that the rest would follow. That the problem was practical, and I could solve it practically." He looked at his hands. "I was wrong about that." "You were doing what you knew how to do," Clara said. "It wasn't enough." "No," she agreed. "But that's not the same as being wrong as a person. It's being wrong about what the situation required." She stopped, then added, because it was honest, "I've been wrong about what situations required too. More times than I like to count." He looked at her. 7 selection towns. "Among other things." What else? She considered how much to give him. She'd become over the years economical with her own history. Not secretive, just careful. The way you're careful with anything that's been handled roughly often enough that you've stopped being certain of its structural integrity. But there was something about the kitchen in the late evening, the fire low, his recovering stillness, that made the usual economy feel wrong. I had an arrangement before, she said. Not like this one. I was 28. A man in Ohio, a merchant, a decent man. We'd been corresponding for several months, and he came to meet me, and we got along well enough, and he made an offer. I accepted. She paused. 3 months before the wedding, his family intervened. His mother. She found someone younger and thought she'd done him a favor. Clara said it simply, the way you say things when the wound is old enough to have closed over, even if the scar pulls sometimes. He wrote me a letter. He said he was sorry. He said his mother wasn't wrong, that a man in his position needed a wife who would, I believe the exact word was, shine. He said I was capable, but not quite what he'd pictured. Colton was quiet. Capable, but not quite what he'd pictured, Clara repeated. I've thought about that phrase more times than I should have. For a long while I tried to figure out how to fix the second part while keeping the first. She almost smiled. You can't, of course. The second part isn't really about you. It's about what someone has decided they deserve, and that's not a thing you can argue with or improve your way out of. He was an idiot, Colton said. He was ordinary, Claire said, which is almost worse. After that evening, something between them settled further. Not into comfort exactly, more into truth. They stopped being careful about the peripheral things. He began asking her opinion on ranch decisions that weren't strictly household matters, whether to expand the herd in spring, what he owed Mercer in terms of recognition for the man's 8 years of loyalty, how he thought about the younger hands who had potential but no direction. She gave him honest answers, not deferential ones, and he received them the way he received everything, without performance, with real attention. Mercer, for his part, had shifted in a way that was subtle enough that Clara might have missed it if she hadn't been paying attention. He still wasn't warm. Warmth was probably not in his register in any direction. But the morning after the storm, when Clara had been in the barn checking on the horses that had been brought inside before the weather hit, Mercer had come in behind her and wordlessly picked up the second brush and worked the far side of the horse she was grooming without being asked. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. They finished the horse, and he moved to the next stall, and she moved to the one after that, and that was the whole of it, but it was a different thing entirely from where they had started. She thought sometimes about what it meant that the hardest person in that place to win over had not been won over by warmth or charm or patience, but simply by duration and consistency. By showing up and continuing to show up until the question of whether she would stick became irrelevant because the answer was obviously yes. She had not changed Mercer's opinion of her. She had made his opinion of her no longer matter to him, which was the more achievable thing, and, in the end, more durable. It was the second week of December, the ground frozen hard and the ranch in its winter operating rhythm, when Eleanor Hayes arrived. She came in a hired wagon from Blackstone Ridge, a small woman in her late 40s with spectacles and a traveling coat that had been mended at both elbows and a satchel so full of papers it wouldn't close properly. She introduced herself to Clara at the door with the directness of a woman accustomed to making her purpose clear before anyone could find a reason to turn her away. She was a former school teacher, now working as an itinerant advocate for frontier children's education, and she had heard about Clara Whitmore Voss through a chain of sources she enumerated briefly and efficiently. The Silver Creek Gathering, a conversation between two ranchers' wives, a name repeated more than once in connection with the phrase, a woman who gets things done. I've heard about you too, Claire said. Come in out of the cold. Eleanor accepted tea and settled at the kitchen table and laid out her position with the brisk clarity of someone who has made this argument many times and has refined it to its essential load-bearing elements. There were 43 children within a 15-mile radius of Iron Valley Ranch. 12 of them were of primary school age and receiving no formal education whatsoever. The nearest schoolhouse was in Blackstone Ridge, 22 miles away, and the road was impassable from November through March. Several families had tried to organize informal instruction over the years, but nothing had held. What was needed was a space, a committed adult, and enough community belief that the thing would actually continue. "I'm not a teacher," Claire said when Eleanor stopped. "You can read and write and calculate, can you?" "Yes. That's the baseline. Everything else is just showing up." Eleanor set her teacup down. "The space is the harder part. Most homesteads don't have a room to spare, and families don't trust each other enough to rotate locations consistently. You have a ranch with space, standing, and a woman who has already demonstrated she can organize a disorganized situation into something functional." She paused. "That's you, Mrs. Voss. I've asked about you carefully." Clara was quiet for a moment. She thought about the boarding house in Ohio, her mother moving between tables with the particular competence of a woman who had absorbed necessity so completely it looked like capability. She thought about the first week in this kitchen, the flour sack a third full, the broken seal on the bean jar, the supply log no one had looked at in months. She had never thought of any of those things as teaching, but Eleanor was describing the same underlying skill with different words. The ability to look at a situation clearly, identify what was missing, and arrange for it to be present. She was still thinking about it when Colton came in from the yard, stamping mud from his boots. He was moving normally now, the recovery complete, the episode of the storm already folding into the ranch's working history. He took in Eleanor and the papers and the expression on Clara's face and read the room with the competence of a man who has spent a lifetime reading outdoor conditions. "What's this?" he said. Eleanor explained herself again, more concisely, while Colton poured his own coffee and stood at the counter and listened with his arms crossed and his eyes on the table in the way that meant he was actually listening rather than waiting for a turn to speak. "How often?" he said when Eleanor finished. "3 mornings a week to start. If it holds, 5. "Which room?" he said. And this he addressed to Clara, not Eleanor, which Eleanor noticed with a small expression that Clara filed away. "The front room on the east side," Clara said. "It's not being used for anything." "It'll need a proper stove if you're heating it through winter." "I know." Colton looked at Eleanor. "When were you planning to start?" "January, if arrangements can be made. The sooner the better. There are children who have been waiting a long time for this to happen." He looked back at Clara. "Your decision," he said. Not, "I'll allow it," not, "I think you should." Just, your decision, stated as fact, with the same plainness he brought to everything. Clara looked at Eleanor, who was watching her with the quiet intensity of someone who has learned to recognize the moment when a thing either becomes real or doesn't. "January," Clara said. "Give me 3 weeks to prepare the room and get word to the families." Eleanor let out a breath that contained considerably more relief than her composed manner had suggested she was holding. "Good," she said, and then, "Good," again, softer, like the word needed saying twice to be fully real. Colton left them to it. Clara and Eleanor spent the next 2 hours at the kitchen table with the satchel of papers open between them, going through the names of the families and the ages of the children and the rough shape of what a 3-morning-a-week curriculum might look like for children ranging in age from 6 to 13. Eleanor had strong opinions and Clara had useful ones, and they disagreed productively twice, which Clara found encouraging in the way that productive disagreement always is. It meant they were both actually thinking. After Eleanor left, Clara stood at the kitchen window for a while, watching the hired wagon make its way back down the valley road, and she tried to locate what she was feeling. Not the simple feelings, the practicality of the plan, the logistical checklist already assembling itself in the back of her mind. The other thing underneath. She was 33 years old. She had been told she was capable, but not quite what anyone pictured. She had stood on 7 platforms and been found insufficient 7 times, and had spent a significant portion of her adult life running the administrative machinery of other people's visions, boarding houses and households, and now a cattle ranch. While her own vision, if she'd had one, if she'd let herself have one, had remained vague and postponed. She did not know if she could teach children. She genuinely did not know. Eleanor was right that the baseline was modest, and she met it, but there was a distance between meeting a baseline and being useful to a 6-year-old who was trying to understand why letters made sounds, and she had no experience on the far side of that distance. She heard Colton's boots on the porch, and then he was in the kitchen doorway, and he looked at her the way he'd been looking at her since the night on the kitchen floor, without the protective layer that people usually keep between themselves and the things they feel. "You're worried you can't do it," he said. "I don't know if I can do it." "You didn't know if you could manage this ranch when you arrived." "That's different. Managing a household it's not different," he said. "You walked into a situation you didn't fully understand, and you paid attention, and you figured out what was needed, and you did it. That's the same thing." Clara looked at him. "What if I'm wrong? What if I start this and I'm not capable of it, and the families pull their children and Eleanor's work in this territory gets set back because I overestimated myself?" He crossed the kitchen and stood across the table from her. "What did you tell me?" he said. "When I was arguing I could go out to the south fence 2 days after I could barely stand?" Clara was quiet. "You told me that the fence would hold," he said, "that the damage wasn't done yet, and there was time to repair it right rather than fast. You told me to sit down and write things down and let Pete ask the questions, and we'd get to the fence when we could get to the fence." He paused. "You were right. The fence held. What damage there was, we fixed." His eyes were steady on her. "You'll get to the parts you don't know yet when you get to them, Clara. You'll fix what needs fixing." She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her chest did the thing it had been doing since Silver Creek, that unguarded, inconvenient opening, the feeling of being genuinely seen by someone who is not owed the seeing and isn't performing it either. "You're using my own logic against me," she said. "It's good logic," he said. "I'm not sure why you get to use it on other people and not on yourself." She didn't have an answer for that. She hadn't expected to be asked the question. The East Room took 2 weeks to prepare. Clara cleared it herself, assisted by Pete, who turned out to have a useful aptitude for physical arrangement and no opinions about how the room should look beyond wanting things to be level, which Clara appreciated. Colton arranged for a second-hand stove from a hardware merchant in Silver Creek, which arrived on Pete's next supply run and was installed by Calhoun, who knew pipe fittings. Ruth contributed 2 of the household's spare tables without being asked, setting them down in the newly cleared room and looking around it with the expression of a woman who was also revising something internal. Clara wrote 12 letters, 1 to each of the families Eleanor had listed. She stated the arrangement plainly. 3 mornings a week, starting January, no cost. The child needed to arrive by 8 and be collected by noon, and the child needed to want to be there or there was no point. That last condition surprised people when they heard about it. You're offering free schooling and you have a requirement about whether the child wants it? She stood by it. Learning required some form of willing participation. She was not interested in running a room where 12 children waited out 3 hours in order to be somewhere warmer than home. 9 families responded. 8 of them said yes. The night before the first school morning, Clara sat in the East Room alone for a while. 8 chairs, 2 long tables, a small stove doing its best against December. A rough map of the territories she'd drawn herself on a piece of brown paper and pinned to the wall, because she'd needed something on the wall and she could draw a passable map, and she thought children who had only ever known one valley might benefit from understanding they existed in a larger geography. She didn't feel ready. She suspected she wouldn't feel ready, and that ready might not be the point. The next morning, 8 children arrived in the cold and stood in the front room and looked at her with the assorted expressions of the young, curious, wary, bored, one of them actively hostile in the particular way of a 10-year-old boy whose older brother had told him school was for the weak. She looked back at them. She thought about her mother, who had managed a boarding house for 15 years and never had an easy day of it, and had done it anyway because the alternative was worse. She pulled out a chair and sat down at their level. "My name is Clara," she said. "Not Mrs. Voss, just Clara." She looked around the table. "I'm going to be honest with you about something. I haven't done this before. I know things, and I'm going to teach you what I know, and there will probably be days when I do it badly. When that happens, I'd rather you tell me than pretend it didn't happen." She paused. "Does anyone have a problem with that arrangement?" The hostile 10-year-old, she would learn his name was Eli, and he would become, within 6 weeks, the most relentlessly curious student in the room, looked at her with narrowed eyes. "My brother says school is for people who can't work." "Your brother is partly right," Clara said. This isn't instead of work. It's so the work you do later is the work you choose, not just the work you're left with. She held his gaze. Can you read? A little. Then we'll make it more than a little. After that, you can decide for yourself what you think. Eli chewed on this for a moment. Then he pulled his chair closer to the table. Clara reached for the first primer. Outside, through the east window, Iron Valley lay quiet and frozen under the winter sky. The barns, the corrals, the long sweep of pasture running out to where the fence line disappeared into distance. Everything she had arrived to find in disorder and had spent 4 months slowly, imperfectly, persistently setting right. Not because she'd known how, because she'd been willing to stay until she figured it out. She opened the primer to the first page. 8 faces looked at her across the table, waiting. She began. The school did not go smoothly at first, and Clara had not expected it to. The first 2 weeks were an education in the specific difficulty of trying to teach 8 children of wildly different ages and preparation levels in the same room at the same time. Eli, the hostile 10-year-old, could read simple sentences but had never been asked to think about what they meant. A girl named Josephine, 7, could not yet reliably identify all her letters, but had a memory so sharp she could repeat back anything Clara said word for word after hearing it once. A pair of brothers named Samuel and Thomas, 9 and 11, had been taught numbers by their father up to basic multiplication, but had never encountered a written word they didn't already know by sight. Each of them required something different, and Clara had only one primer, one map on the wall, and herself. She made mistakes. She pitched explanations too high and watched eyes go blank, or too low and watched older children's attention drift toward the window. She ran out of prepared material twice in the first week and had to improvise, which produced mixed results. One improvised lesson on how to read a supply ledger, using the ranch's actual accounts, turned out to be the most engaged the older children had been all week, which told her something she filed away carefully. She sent a child home with a misunderstood assignment and had to spend the beginning of the next morning session untangling it, which cost time she didn't have. She told Colton about all of this at the kitchen table in the evenings, not asking for help exactly, but needing to say it out loud to someone who would respond honestly. He listened, asked questions, occasionally said something that reframed the problem in a way she hadn't tried. He had no more experience with children's education than she did, but he had 20 years of managing people who had different skills and different temperaments and needed different kinds of direction. And the underlying structure of that problem was not entirely different from hers. The ledger lesson, he said one night. What did it do that the primer didn't? It was real, Claire said. It had numbers that meant something. Actual quantities, actual money. Eli asked why the winter supply run cost more than the summer one, and we spent 20 minutes on it, and he didn't look out the window once. So they need it to mean something. The younger ones don't as much. Josephine doesn't care if it's real. She just wants the pattern of it, the letters, the sounds. She'd do it all day if I let her. Clara paused. The older ones are different. They need to see the use of it, or they're just sitting in a chair to please their parents. That's not different from grown men, Colton said. Tell a hand to dig a post hole and he digs it. Tell him why the fence needs to go there, and he digs it better and asks useful questions on the next one. Clara looked at him across the table. I'm going to start bringing real problems into the school. Supply calculations, distance problems using the actual territory, letters written to real recipients. I'll need paper. You'll get paper. More than we have. I'll talk to Pete. By week 4, the room had changed. Not dramatically. It was still a repurposed east-facing room with a second-hand stove and a hand-drawn map and 8 children with mud on their boots. But the quality of attention inside it was different. The ledger problems had become a regular feature. Clara had begun having the older children help the younger ones with letters and sounds, which served 2 purposes. It gave Josephine and the other young ones patient instruction, and it forced Eli and the older students to understand something well enough to explain it, which required a depth of comprehension that simply being able to do it yourself did not. Eli, predictably, was terrible at explaining things at first. He knew the answer and could not understand why the other person didn't know it, which produced frustration on both sides. Clara sat with him after school one afternoon. His mother had given permission for the extra time, and told him that explaining was the harder skill, not the easier one. If you can do it, you've learned it halfway, she said. If you can explain it so someone else can do it, you've learned it all the way. He thought about this with the concentrated frown of a child who doesn't want to admit something is making sense. That's why you have us teach each other, he said. Partly. It's also so you don't have to teach all of us at once. Clara looked at him. Yes, she said. That too. Both things can be true. He almost smiled. He would never quite smile at her directly for the entire first winter, which she came to understand was simply how he was built and not a referendum on her. Word traveled the way word travels in isolated communities, slowly at first, then all at once. By February, Eleanor Hayes had sent 2 letters asking for updates and had passed the information along to her network of frontier education advocates in 3 other territories. A family from 8 miles further out, the Brennans, arrived at the ranch in late January asking if their daughter could attend. They had heard from the Mercer family, Wade Mercer's family, which surprised Clara enough that she had to compose her expression carefully, that the school was worth the ride. Wade Mercer recommended the school, Colton said when she told him. His daughter is not in our group, Clara said. She's 15, too old for what we're doing, but apparently he told the Brennans it was, I'm told the exact phrase was, a serious operation run by a capable woman. Colton was quiet for a moment. High praise from Wade. I believe it's the most words he's ever said about me that weren't negative, Clara said. I'm choosing to receive it as a complete reversal. Colton laughed. A real one, unguarded, the kind that started in his chest. She had been collecting those laughs since December without admitting to herself that she was doing it. The Brennan girl, whose name was Nora, was indeed too old for the primer work, but she could barely read, and Clara was not willing to send her home. She rearranged the schedule, put Nora with the older students on the ledger work, and spent 1 additional morning a week working with her separately on reading. Nora was embarrassed about her deficiency in the way that older children are, acutely, privately, in a way that required handling with a precision Clara had to develop, because she hadn't needed it with the younger ones. She told Nora directly in their first private session that the embarrassment was the natural result of a world that had failed to teach her something it was obligated to teach her, and that embarrassment should therefore be directed outward rather than inward, and that in this room the only thing that mattered was whether they made progress today versus yesterday. Nora looked at her with the complicated expression of a 15-year-old girl being told something she wants to believe and isn't sure she's allowed to. How do you not feel, she started, then stopped. How do I not feel what? Clara said. My mother says you were turned away from 7 selections before you came here. She said it with the halting care of someone who knows they may be trespassing. Didn't that make you feel like something was wrong with you? Clara was quiet for a moment, not because the question hurt. It had stopped having that particular power over her sometime around the 2nd month at the ranch, but because it deserved a real answer and not a convenient one. Yes, she said, for a long time. You take in what the world tells you about yourself when there's nothing louder inside to argue back. She paused. The problem was I kept thinking the selections were measuring something real. That if 7 men looked past me, that meant I was actually less than. But they weren't measuring me. They were measuring me against a picture they already had in their heads. A picture I didn't match. She looked at Nora. You can't match a picture you're not in. That's not a failure, it's just a mismatch. Nora absorbed this. What changed? Someone came looking for something the picture didn't account for, Clara said, and it turned out I had that in abundance. Shuts. They got back to the reading. Spring came to Iron Valley the way it always came to high country, reluctantly, in fits, with cold snaps in March that threatened what the February thaw had started. The school had been running for 4 months. Eleanor Hayes made the trip from Blackstone Ridge for a visit in April, sitting in on a morning session with the quiet attentiveness of a woman doing a professional assessment, and afterward told Clara, over tea, that what she was doing was more sophisticated than anything she'd expected. It's not a primer school, Eleanor said. It's something else. You've built a method. I've built what works for this group, Clara said. I don't know if it works for other groups. That's what we find out, Eleanor said. She opened her perpetually overfull satchel. I've been in correspondence with 2 other families in the Southern Territory who have the same problem. Children, no school, a community that wants one but no one who's done it before. They're asking me for a model. She slid a piece of paper across the table. I'd like to document what you've done here. Not to copy it exactly, to give people a starting point. Clara looked at the paper. It was a request, written formally, for her to describe her approach in writing for distribution through Eleanor's network. I'm not an educator, Clara said for what felt like the 100th time. No, Eleanor agreed. You're something more useful. You're a person who looked at an intractable problem and solved it practically. She tapped the paper. That's what these families need to see as possible, not a formal curriculum written by someone who's never met their children. An account of a real attempt, with what worked and what didn't. Clara looked at the paper for a moment longer. Then she picked up a pen. She wrote Eleanor's document over 2 weeks, in the evenings after the household work was done, and the school day was over and the ranch had settled into its nighttime sounds. She wrote it the same way she'd done everything else since arriving at Iron Valley. Directly, without decoration, saying what she'd tried and what had failed and why and what she'd replaced it with. She wrote about the ledger lessons, and about Eli, and about Nora, and about the discovery that mixed-age teaching, done deliberately, produced better results than age segregation in a small room with one adult. She wrote about the map on the wall. She wrote about the importance of the problem being real. Colton read it one night when she'd left a draft on the kitchen table. She found him still there when she came down for water, the pages in his hands. You should send this to More Than Eleanor's network, he said. It's a teaching document for people starting community schools. I know what it is. He set the pages down. Clara, this is good work. She looked at him. He was not a man who said things to make you feel better. She had known that since the first week. Send it to the Territorial Education Board, he said. Not just Eleanor's contacts. To the people who actually set policy. The Territorial Board doesn't receive documents from ranch women with no credentials. The Territorial Board receives documents from Iron Valley Ranch, he said, which has standing in this territory. I'll sign it with you if that helps. She thought about this for a long moment. She thought about her mother, who had run the Ohio boarding house for 15 years and had known more about household economics and human management than anyone who had ever employed her, and who had never once had the occasion or the authority to put that knowledge where it could be useful to anyone beyond the 40-foot radius of her own walls. She thought about the merchant in Ohio and the word capable and the way he'd used it as a consolation prize, a thing you acknowledge when you can't find anything else to say. Yes, she said. All right. The document went out in May, over both their names, to the Territorial Education Board and to Eleanor's wider network. A response came back in July. Not an official endorsement, not a formal adoption of anything, but a letter from the board's secretary indicating that the document had been circulated internally and that 2 members had expressed interest in a correspondence. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of a raised hand in a crowded room, small and not yet committed, but it was something. Eleanor came back in August with news. A family in the Southern Territory had started a school using Clara's document as a framework. 3 children so far. They'd hit some of the same early problems. They'd sent questions through Eleanor. Clara wrote back. That correspondence became a thread that connected to others, in the unhurried way of things that grow because they're useful, rather than because anyone is pushing them. By the end of that year, Clara had exchanged letters with 7 different families in 4 territories, all of them trying variations of the same thing. A small room, a practical adult, children who needed something the nearest formal school was too far away to provide. She was not running a movement. She was answering letters. But the 2 things are sometimes indistinguishable from the outside. The school at Iron Valley ran through a second winter, larger now, 11 children by November, the room rearranged to accommodate them. A second table added that Mercer had built without being asked and deposited in the room one morning before school started with no explanation and no ceremony. Clara looked at the table for a moment when she found it, thought about the man who had told her the ranch ran fine before she arrived, and found she had nothing to say about it that wasn't already said by the table itself. It was on an evening in the 2nd December. The ranch's lamps lit against the early dark, snow on the ground, the school day done and the household quiet, that Colton finally said the thing he had been saying in every other register for more than a year. He said it in the kitchen, unremarkably, while they were going over the winter supply list together. He set his pencil down and looked at her and said, "I love you. I want to make sure you know that." Clara looked up from the list. He was watching her with the direct, uncomplicated attention that had characterized him since the very first moment on the platform step. No performance, no management of what his face was doing. "I know," she said. "I wanted to say it plainly," he said, "not be the kind of man who lets the actions do all the work and never says the thing." "It was clear," she said. "It's been clear for a while." "Then why didn't you say anything?" "Because I was waiting to see if you would," she said. "I didn't want to be the only one who said it." He looked at her for a moment. "Have you known for a long time?" "Since the night of the storm," she said. "Or thereabouts?" "That was last December." "Yes?" "Clara, that was a year ago." "I'm a patient woman," she said, "when I have to be." He shook his head in a way that meant he was not actually exasperated, which she had learned to distinguish from the way he shook his head when he was. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. A simple, grounding gesture, the kind that doesn't require a response because it is itself the whole conversation. "I love you," she said. "I should have said it months ago." "We got there," he said. They got back to the supply list. There are things that nobody tells you about a life built under difficult conditions, and one of them is this. The building itself changes you in ways that happiness alone wouldn't. Easy lives produce certain kinds of people, pleasant people, often, comfortable people, people who are good company in good circumstances. But the life that requires you to keep going when every available signal is telling you to stop, to recalibrate when the thing you tried didn't work, to stay present in a room full of people who initially didn't want you there, that life produces a different kind of knowledge. Not wisdom exactly, because wisdom sounds like something you arrive at and Clara didn't feel arrived. More like fluency. The ability to read a difficult situation without panic, to locate the useful action inside the impossible one, to understand that most things that look like walls are actually doors that open in directions you haven't thought to push yet. Clara had not set out to become a person of standing in the territory of Iron Valley. She had set out, in the most minimal sense, to survive the next 60 days without humiliating herself further. Everything else had been the result of showing up fully to whatever the current day required. Not heroically, not with any particular grace, but consistently, imperfectly, without retreating into smaller versions of herself, even when smaller would have been safer. She thought about this on a morning in the following spring, standing outside the ranch house while the valley came back to life around her. The grass returning, the cattle moving across the far fields, the sound of children's voices coming from the east room, where the school was already in session without her because on Tuesdays she'd taught Eli to open the room and start the younger ones on their letters. And he did it with a serious, proprietary authority that was almost funny and also genuinely good. She had not set out to become a teacher. She had not set out to write documents that traveled to 4 territories and started 7 correspondence chains. She had not set out to become the person that Wade Mercer eventually, in the second winter, stopped pointedly ignoring and started speaking to in the direct manner he used with people he considered real. Not warmth, still not warmth, but the level, undecorated regard of a man who had revised his position and was not going to make a drama of it. She had set out to find somewhere that needed what she could actually do. She had found it in the most improbable form. A cattle ranch in a narrow valley, run by a man who chose her not for what she looked like, but for the fact that she hadn't broken, and who turned out, beneath the brutal practicality, beneath the grief and the walls he'd built with his own hands to contain it, to be the most honest person she'd ever known. A man who said what he meant and meant what he said and let her be herself without requiring her to be anything else, which was rarer than it should be and more valuable than almost anything she could name. She had found it in a room of 8 children who became 11, who became, by the second spring, a waiting list. Families from further out wanting to know when there would be a space. Eleanor's letters getting thicker every month. The territorial board's correspondence moving slowly from interested to formally supportive, in the way of institutions that need to believe something is stable before they'll say so out loud. She had found it in Ruth, who had started as a skeptical observer and had become something adjacent to a friend. Not a demonstrative friendship, not one that used that word, but the kind built from shared daily work and mutual respect and the particular knowledge of someone you've spent 2 winters with in the same house. Ruth had started coming to the school on Friday mornings, not as a student, but simply to sit in the back. She never explained why. Clara never asked. The presence was its own statement. She had found it even, improbably, in Mercer, who had delivered that table in December without explanation and had, in January, appeared in the school doorway one morning to fix a stovepipe connection that had come loose and was making the room smoke. He'd fixed it, tested it, and left without speaking to anyone, including the 6 children who had watched him with varying degrees of astonishment. After that, small repairs appeared at intervals: a window latch, a board on the step that had begun to wobble, a hook beside the door for coats that simply materialized one morning. Clara had begun to think of these as Mercer's particular dialect of acknowledgement, and she received each one with the same wordless respect with which they were given. A person is not unwanted, Clara had come to believe, in the absolute way the world sometimes tries to tell them. A person is either in the right place or not yet in it. The difference between those two states can look, from the inside of the wrong place, indistinguishable from a permanent verdict. 7 platforms. 7 rooms full of men who looked past her. 7 nights packing a bag and calculating what the next stage ticket would cost, and whether she had enough left to manage another month of trying. She had been in the wrong places. She had been measured against the wrong pictures. She had been told, in 7 different frontier towns, that she did not match what was wanted, and she had believed it in the way that repetition makes you believe things even when you know better, the way water eventually shapes stone not because it's stronger, but because it keeps coming. And then a man had walked into a selection warehouse in Blackstone Ridge, looking for something the selection process had no category for, and he had found her sitting on the platform step with her suitcase beside her and her back straight and her jaw set. And he had asked not how old she was or whether she had family in the territory, but how many times she had been told no and whether she had broken yet. She had not broken. She was still not broken. She was, in fact, standing here in the spring morning with the east room full of children's voices and the valley spreading out around her and the life she had built with her own stubborn, imperfect hands extending in every direction she could see, something the opposite of broken. The door to the east room opened and Eli appeared in it, 12 now, grown an inch over the winter, with the expression of a boy performing his authority with slightly more seriousness than the occasion required. "Josephine says she already knows this week's material," he called to Clara. "She says she needs something harder." "She's probably right," Clara called back. "Tell her to start on the next primer section. I'll be in a minute." "She also says Thomas is copying her sums." "Tell Thomas to copy them correctly then, and explain to me how he got each answer when I come in." Eli processed this. A small shift crossed his face, the architectural precondition for a smile that he would probably stop suppressing eventually, when he decided it was consistent with his self-image. He went back inside. Clara stood in the spring morning for one more moment. The valley, the barns, the sound of the ranch working its daily machinery around her. Boots on gravel, someone calling across the yard, the distant low of cattle being moved to the east pasture now that the grass was coming back. The same sound she had heard on her first morning here, lying in the upstairs room with the south window, listening to a world she didn't yet belong to and wasn't sure she would. She belonged to it now. Or rather, it belonged to her, which was a different thing and the better one. Not given. Not arranged. Not the result of someone's charity or a lucky match or a picture she'd finally managed to fit herself into. Built, imperfectly, practically, day by day, from what she had and what the place needed and the gap between those two things, which she had spent more than a year closing by hand. She turned and went inside to her children. And Colton was in the kitchen when she passed through it, reading the morning's correspondence with a cup of coffee going cold at his elbow, the way it always went cold because he always forgot it. He looked up. The particular look, direct, unhidden, not performing anything. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. She went through the door to the schoolroom. Behind her, she heard him pick up his coffee, discover it had gone cold, and set it back down with the specific muted sound of a man who has done this exact thing so many times he no longer bothers to be annoyed about it. Some things you don't fix, some things you just live with, and they become part of the texture of a day, and eventually you'd miss them if they were gone. She opened the door. 8 faces, 11 now, with Nora in the back and the 2 new Brennan children near the window, turned toward her, different ages, different speeds, different things they needed from this room, all of them here, all of them, improbably and practically, and one difficult day at a time, becoming more than what they'd been. She pulled out her chair. She sat down. She began,